In 1783, at the age of 27, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart composed his duos in G and B flat for violin and viola, and ever since they have remained the most frequently performed and recorded violin and viola duos in the world, a close second being Martinou's three madrigals for violin and viola duo, which will conclude the Czechoslovak violin in New York. Mozart's impetus for composing his two famous violin and viola duos was a request made by a friend and colleague in need. The story goes that in 1783, Michael Haydn, Joseph Haydn's younger brother and an excellent composer in his own right, was in a bind. Michael, who excelled more in the composition of sacred vocal music than the symphonies and chamber music that his brother was just beginning to make so famous in London and France, received a commission from his Salzburg employer, the infamous Archbishop Colloredo, to compose a set of 6 duos for violin and viola. Unable to complete the commission due to an illness, and therefore seriously in danger of having his salary withheld, Michael Haydn asked Mozart to step in. Mozart completed the pre-ordered set of 6 violin viola duos by tacking on his 2 duos, which, of course, he attributed to Michael Haydn, to his friend in need, already completed 4. But as one might expect, Mozart's 2 duos in B-flat major and G major stand out against Michael's completed 4, most likely due to how Mozart, 1, wrote more chamber music than Michael Haydn, and 2, as the Sinfonia Concertante for violin, viola, and orchestra makes quite explicit, tended to treat the viola with more inspiration and justice than most other composers who were active in his day. Across all 4 of Michael Haydn's contributions to the 1783 set of 6, the violist almost always serves as accompanist to the violinist. Viola doesn't have very much to do, to say the least. But in Mozart's attempts, the viola and violin are on significantly more equal footing. Like Michael Haydn's duos, each of Mozart's duos is in 3 movements, and throughout both, Mozart obtains a full sound, almost quartet-like, consistently going to great lengths to ensure the equality of part writing. For the B-flat major violin viola duo, which Martinů loved but you will unfortunately not have a chance to hear today, Mozart begins the first movement with a slow introduction and launches into a sonata allegro form. This opening movement is then followed by a song-like slow movement, and the whole duo ends with the theme in 6 variations. The G major violin viola duo, whose first movement you will hear performed live and in person momentarily, begins with a flashy and once again full-sounding allegro, which is followed by a very lyrical adagio, which in turn is followed by what I consider to be a more nervous allegro. For now, enjoy the first movement from Mozart's violin viola duo in G major from 1783. The performers Danielle Farina and Laura Jean Goldberg will come and play for us. How about that? Much slower version I'm used to hearing, and I really liked it. So thank you, Laura and Danielle. Chances are, if you've been reading the morning paper at the breakfast table on August 4th, 1946, and it just so happened to have turned to the arts section of the New York Times, your eye would have been drawn to Times writer Ruth or Keir Ben Greenhouse's announcement of the formation of a new and largely cooperative classical music venture that would continue through the 1950s successfully, and whose members would be chosen from a veritable who's who of post-war New York classical musicians. The name of this risky and cooperative effort was the Musicians Guild Incorporated, and as you can see, in addition to serving as an official founding announcement, Greenhouse's blurb provided the Guild with publicity for a series of 4 Monday night concerts that would take place in Times Hall in the new year. Out of the 4 publicized concerts mentioned in the article excerpt displayed on the projection screen, the January 20th debut of the Guild is of most relevance for the Czechoslovak viola in New York, because this is the event where and when Martinů was inspired to compose his 3 violin and viola madrigals for Lillian and Joseph Fuchs, the sibling virtuosos and Guild members who would ultimately premiere Martinú's 3 madrigals, as well as play the role of its dedicatees. According to a review of the Guild's January 20th, 1947 concert by legendary New York Times music critic Howard Taubman, the Guild musicians played 4 compositions in total and showcased, quote, music making of rare distinction and for an almost unbeatable value, unquote. One surmises that such value was facilitated by how, on principle, none of the Guild's 9 distinguished members would receive a cent for their Guild-related performances. The Guild's January 20th debut at Times Hall began with some classics. Programmed next to French Romantic composer Gabriel Fauré's dense 1879 piano quartet in C minor was Beethoven's Opus 95 F minor string quartet, the so-called Quartetto Serioso, which is a label that just about perfectly encapsulates the overall seriousness and tradition-bound nature of the Guild players. But providing quality performances of more established compositions like Beethoven and Fauré was only one of the stated aims of the Guild. Another aim was to program at least 1 contemporary composition for each Monday concert. And luckily, for its contemporary composition, the Guild chose to perform Martinú's luscious string sextet for 2 violins, 2 violas, and 2 cellos in 3 movements. And I say luckily because Martinů, despite the side effects of the injuries he sustained from his accident at the Berkshire Summer Music School early in the summer, decided to attend the Guild's debut concert, presumably to catch a performance by some of the foremost musical professionals in New York City of a composition he had written in 1932 and had been waiting to hear. But by attending the Guild's January 20th, 1947 debut, Martinů got something extra. He had the opportunity to witness a performance of Mozart's B-flat duo for violin and viola by Guild co-founders and sibling virtuosos Joseph and Lillian Fuchs. And as I said, it was Lillian on viola and Joseph on violin who provided Martinů the impetus for his 3 madrigals for violin and viola. And now is an opportune time to provide you all with brief portraits of these 2 massively influential American musicians. Born in New York City, siblings Joseph and Lillian Fuchs were the children of Kate Weiss Fuchs and Philip Fuchs. By trade, their father, Philip, was a furrier. However, his true calling seemed to be the violin, and after his company moved to Canada, Lillian Joseph's father's passion for the violin became the family's primary source of income. Supplemented by odd jobs like raising canaries and catering, Philip was able to devote more time to teaching talented students who came from mostly poorer Jewish families. Philip's passion for music would rub off on Joseph, Lillian, as well as their younger brother Harry, a renowned cellist whose story, as it applies to the Czechoslovak viola in New York, quite unfortunately, must stop here. At the age of 4, Joseph Fuchs' violin career started by accident. After Joseph had fallen and broken his left arm, his doctor suggested that upon the cast's removal, the boy should try to strengthen the weakened limb by playing violin. Therefore, a childhood injury to a limb on his left side started Joseph Fuchs on a path to touring internationally as a virtuoso violinist and becoming concertmaster of the Cleveland Orchestra in 1926. But in one of those sorts of darkly comical moments of cosmic balance or imbalance, depending upon one's vantage point, It was a different injury to his left side, the atrophy of his left-hand fingers, that would force Joseph Fuchs to leave his Cleveland orchestra post at the start of the 1940s. While the injury ended his life as an orchestral player, it opened up other possibilities. After getting surgery on his hand, he, like Martinů, after the composer had fallen at the summer courses, would return to chamber music in order to retrain his body and his mind. The musical life of Lillian Fuchs, who would eventually become one of the most significant violists of the 20th century, started in a not entirely uncommon manner for a young woman in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The path that would lead Lillian to the viola started with her playing the piano. However, her frequent observation of her father and brother playing the violin would encourage Lillian to reconsider what kind of instrumentalist she wanted to be. Although it wouldn't have been necessarily encouraged nor expected that she quit the piano in order to play the violin, her brother Joseph would soon leave to tour Europe, and with her brother in absentia, Lillian started playing the violin, composing and winning many prestigious awards. By 1926, Lillian had been invited to play second fiddle in an all-female string quartet. Her father would have none of this, not because it was an all-female string quartet, which actually wasn't that novel for the time, but because, quote, he was not going to have his daughter play second fiddle to anyone, end quote. The three remaining players in this new and risky venture, Marion Kniesel, Elizabeth Wirt, and Phyllis Kreiker, found a brilliant and fortuitous loophole. They would extend a second invitation to Lillian as violist. Lillian's father was still not entirely convinced about Lillian switching instruments once again, but Franz Kniesel, the young virtuoso's violin teacher at what was then called the Institute of Musical Art, but is now called Juilliard, made a convincing case for Lillian's switch to viola by stressing, quote, the positive aspects of a violinist, small in stature, mastering an instrument that was slightly larger than the one she was used to playing, end quote. So Lillian was about 4'11", just to give you an idea. And the viola was always kind of considered a big instrument anyways, which was one of the faults that Franz found with it as well. So Lillian joined the all-female quartet, albeit only for a short time before she went on to other equally impressive activities, ensembles, and as a soloist. And prior to the New York Post's March 1927 announcement of the quartet's debut, the marvelous Mrs. Future Stein Fuchs was diligent in adjusting her technique to the larger instrument and accommodating her playing to an inner voice in the quartet's four-part texture. Incidentally, for the quartet's concert in 1927, its premiere, Dvorak's aforementioned American String Quartet, with the viola's artfully placed entrance in the first movement, would be one of the debuts program's highlights. But let's leap back to the future and find our footing in 1947, so as to gradually make our way to the ending of the lecture portion of this lecture recital. Shortly after the successful January 20th debut, the Musicians Guild Incorporated commissioned Martinů to compose a piece that would have its premiere at the opening concert of the Guild's second season, which was scheduled for December 22nd of 1947. Despite the second season being almost a year away and Martinú's convalescent state, the composer likely was thankful for the minor dent that the Guild Commission would make in the high cost of his medical bills, as he was excited to get back the composition time he had lost, commenced working on the 3D madrigals on the 17th of February. With characteristic speed and enviable concentration, Martinů completed the 3 madrigals for violin and viola a month later. In a review of the December 22nd, 1947 Guild concert, which doubled as the 3 madrigals debut, Howard Taubman, once again, offering his first impressions, described Martinú's 3 madrigals as, quote, unaffected, clear, concise, imaginative, and certainly not without grace or repose, end quote. Akin to Mozart's G major violin viola duo, which you heard an excerpt from at the start of the lecture recital's second half, Martinú's outer madrigals, madrigals 1 and 3, both begin in duple meter, are played in brisker tempos, and generally serve as distorted mirror images of one another. Also, each outer madrigal is marked with outbursts of irrepressible joy. For contrast, the second madrigal is more somber and begins in triple meter. Its sound world is full of trills, tremolos, and other kinds of shaky figures that are perhaps paradoxically evocative of both instability and restfulness. And the bulk of the movement is generally muted in its tone, literally. Because in contrast with the violin and viola's almost brassy brightness of tone color throughout madrigal number 1 and madrigal number 3, prior to madrigal number 2, Martinů instructs both players to put mutes on their instruments, later directing them to remove them for dramatic effect somewhere around the second madrigal's midpoint. Each madrigal is unique, but common to all three is Martinú's Mozart-like efforts to provide equal billing for each instrumentalist in the part writing, which seems to be most clearly expressed in how madrigal number 1's first melodic theme area is shared, unaltered except by register in each iteration, by both violinist and violist. So I'm going to call my... So the violinist first plays the melodic figure of a big leap, which she then balances with an almost lyrical cascading descent. The leap followed by descent figure is then answered with a series of 3 melodic figures, each with a narrow melodic compass devoid of anything like the antecedent's wide, distinctive leap and whimsical fall. While the violin plays this question and answer, the violist provides her rock-solid, driving, repetitive accompaniment. After the violin plays through its 2 contrasting ideas, the instruments switch roles, the viola taking the 2 just mentioned contrasting ideas and the violin putting on the hat of accompanist. And such role exchange then pervades the remainder of the 3 madrigals. And Laura and Danielle are now going to play just the main theme, the first main theme of the first madrigal. Switch, and the viola takes the place of the violin. So that's the kind of dynamic that you can expect throughout the piece as a whole. Then as regards musical themes and motifs, Martinů generates the entirety of the first madrigal, including the just demonstrated question and answer, from a handful of extraordinarily simple musical ideas, and what I can only call concepts, which he then goes on to make thematic across madrigal number 1. Martinů never wanted to be particularly vague or hard to understand, simultaneously introduces and integrates every motive and concept made pervasive theme in the first 10 seconds of madrigal 1. First, there's the rhythmic da-da-da-da-dum. Please play that. Okay. That's one thing. That generates a lot of music. Okay, so then there's technique taken from, then there's the iambic rhythm figure, which sounds like a heartbeat. Okay, so that's the one right after the da-da-da-dum.
From the beginning once again?
Yeah, sure. So just the iambic, so each one. Like a heartbeat. So then there's a technique taken from medieval polyphonic music called a hocket, which in Old French just basically means hiccup, and which in musical technical terms is nothing more than a device of alternating between parts, single notes, or groups of notes, with the results being more or less continuous flow, with one voice resting while the other voice sounds. And Martinů often brings the da-da-da-dum rhythm, along with the heartbeat rhythm, within the hocket's orbit. And this putting the 2 rhythmic ideas in the hocket's orbit is not only manifested in sound of the first 10 measures in madrigal 1 and beyond, it is also revealed in the movement of the players. So you can see the hocket translated into movement as you're playing. So if you can't hear it, you can still see it. So just
What phrase do you want?
the first 2 minutes. Okay, so these 3 very simple ideas and concepts produce everything that basically comes after. Everything is generated from those 3 things. Now that Martinů does this is not so interesting in and of itself. However, when one realizes that all these little ideas seem to be taken from the most unassuming parts of Mozart's G major duo, then things become slightly more interesting. And while going through all of these connections would be tedious, I will ask Laura and Danielle to play one more example. Laura and Danielle, would you please play the first theme from the first movement of Mozart's duo in G major from 1883, in which the heartbeat-like rhythms become momentarily prominent. So going with our theme of Cinderella No More, the tiny taken for granted melodic rhythmic fragment ideas, one might happen to look over due to some preconceived notion of what constitutes thematic material, like an iambic rhythm or a melodic hiccup, are what Martinů detects, senses, and perceives, and then follows. Also, in the end, what is more core, more elementary than a heartbeat? And so without further ado, we will end the program with a performance of madrigal the first madrigal from Martinú's three madrigals from 1947. And after that, I'll be open for questions, but aside. Thank you.